Hey everyone, Warwick's here. So Blizzard announced some initial preview changes that they're making to the four returning non-War Within dungeons in Season 1 of the War Within. Now, I've been on record saying that the four dungeons that they've chosen are all very poor decisions. Now, that said, I've kind of expected that they were going to make a lot of changes to them. Now, one of the things that so, and I'll throw that video up there, but basically I did a 30-minute rant on why these dungeons are bad. But basically, the majority of the criticism that I have is that in three of the four dungeons, which was Siege of Boralus, Necrotic Wake, and Grim Batal, you do things that don't involve your character actually killing the dungeon. You use things that are found within the dungeon. And to me, I think that's really poor design. I think these dungeons are all pretty garbage as a result, because the thing that determines whether or not you're going to time the key efficiently is not something that you're doing as a player, but it's how do you use a weapon in the game. So the strategy behind it is very minimal. And ultimately, into something like Necrotic Wake, it was just you held everything except Malfunctioning Goliaths until the very end, the last two bosses, because on Tyrannical Weeks in particular, those bosses were torture. Siege of Boralus had the Ashbane Spotter tech, and Grim Batal has its dragon riding section that's in the very early parts of the dungeon, and then very, very, very long walks in that dungeon, which is going to make travel time really brutal, and it's going to extend the timer unless they do something interesting with that. Tirna Scithe was a dungeon that had a too steep DPS check on the first boss, and then a weak aura that basically kind of became mandatory in order to effectively maneuver through the second section all the way up to the second boss, which in and of itself wasn't always easy. And then a third boss that had entirely too much HP. Like, it was like a 5-6 minute fight on the highest keys, or at the highest end of your like skill level, to the point that it was almost as long as some of the boss fights. It was longer than a lot of the boss fights in the raids of that expansion, which to me is never a bad thing. But that said, they are making some changes. I've been open-minded to the fact that these changes are here. I'm still not excited about any of these dungeons. I think when you have a dungeon like Motherlode from Battle for Azeroth sitting there, you have a dungeon like Sanguine Depths from Shadowlands that's sitting there. I don't think they should really take anything from Cataclysm anymore. Like, Throne of the Tides was kind of the peak, in my opinion. And even then, that was still very a mid-dungeon. And then, you have Sanguine Depths, and then even Halls of Atonement, the Revendreth dungeons, I think were both the best dungeons out of that expansion. And you basically forgo them to bring in these. To me, you're not kicking off. And I'm also a big proponent that Season 1 should just be all the War Within dungeons. That's my opinion. But let's talk about this. So, Siege of Boralus. Players of both factions will go through the Alliance version of the dungeon to Mythic and Mythic Plus. I have a problem with this because the Alliance version was like a minute to minute and a half longer because of RP. Now, if you can cut the RP, then it's mostly fine. Like, most of the pulls there were fairly similar in terms of difficulty. One or two that were harder, but one or two that were easier than the Horde version. So, as long as they cut out the RP, this could be okay. But if they don't cut out the extra RP that happens, then they're just artificially adding a timer, a 90-second stand-around timer, which is not really the best. That's one of the reasons why Dawn of the Infinites, even with all the RP that they cut, it's one of the reasons why that dungeon wasn't really loved. It's because you were just standing there for 30 and 40 seconds at a time waiting for someone to talk instead of advancing through the dungeon. Ashbane Spotter's sighted artillery no longer damages enemy creatures. I kind of figured they would remove this tech. Now, they do need to do something else with this dungeon. Clearly needs a lot more changes. I think the bosses all need to be looked at and adjusted, and a lot of the trash needs to be looked at and adjusted. So this is a decent start for Siege of Boralus, but there are still a lot of things about the dungeon now that you can't kill enemies with sighted artillery. You're going to need to do some tuning and some tweaking with the trash mobs in that dungeon so that it doesn't feel awful. And I think all four bosses need to be looked at. Necrotic Wake, Malfunctioning Goliath, disabled in Mythic and Mythic Plus. So it still works in Normal and Heroic if you have an old Kyrian in your group, but at those dungeon levels it probably doesn't matter. The fact that they're disabled in Mythic Plus, good thing. Forgotten Hammer, removed, great. Bloody Javelin, initial damage reduced by 90% and applies a stacking vulnerability to enemies hit. So you're still probably going to save this for bosses in Tyrannical Week in your biggest trash pull packs in Fortified Weeks. But it's not going to do like 50% of mob health when you throw it down. That's probably good. It's probably only going to do like 10% now, which is okay. I still don't like it, but it's at least there, and there's a strategy behind using it, and the vulnerability makes it so that the majority of the damage being done to enemy mobs is being done by players, which is, in my opinion, what should be the case all the time. Discarded shield is no longer a channeled effect, and they can use abilities after the shield is activated. Discarded shield was very niche anyways. The fact that it was a channel made it very, very hard. And they've adjusted all the updated spawning locations for these things. So overall, I think these changes are fine. They need to fix the terrain in the Necropolis so that you can use ground targeted abilities, because almost every ground targeted ability failed in that dungeon, that section of the dungeon, which means things like Rain of Fire for Warlocks, or back then when it was ground targeted for Moonkins. I think it was that expansion, it was still ground targeted. They just didn't work. Blizzard is going to be the same way for Frost Mage, for example. So they need to fix the terrain so that that can be done. And then again, they need to remove the 4 portal channeler, I think they're called harvesters, in the beginning, because that really limited trash mob choice in that front room, which was potentially a room that was extremely exciting to pull. But once you realize just how gross those mobs were, it just limited the choice. You just go around the right edge all the time. And it limited your ability to do truly effective maneuvering on that first boss. So still a lot of work to do in Necrotic Wake, but again, they took the thing that is the most egregious aspect of it and have nerfed it significantly in the weapons. That's fine. And Mr. Tirna Scithe, Vine Gates and checkpoints can now be used by Tauren, High Mountain Tauren, Night Elf, Druids, and Herbalists. Weird. Like, okay, you don't make it a Night Fae thing anymore, which is fine. But, like, limiting it to specific races, a specific class, and a specific profession still doesn't change the fact that those, like, that still just feels bad. Because what happens if you just happen to have none of those? And I can think of a group comp that I've played with this season that has none of those. We're just screwed. Like, just make it so that anyone can use these. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Just let it be used by anybody. So not as many changes as I was hoping. I was hoping we'd be able to get some more changes that they were thinking about. How they're going to handle Grim Batal. How are they going to handle the tuning of some of these bosses that were pretty bloody, brutal, bad. I mean, Necrotic Wake and Mist of Tirna Scithe, in my opinion, have 3 or 4 of some of the worst bosses in the game, period. So overall, not groundbreaking changes in my opinion. These are things that all felt pretty obvious, but hopefully they continue to make some more changes. I think they really need to do a lot of work on these dungeons to make them up to date for what players are going to want out of their dungeons. They're clearly not totally paying attention to the community feedback on these anyways, because we got the level 4 affixes that we got that, in my opinion, still don't meet the goals that they stated in that exact post. Here, they're making a decent start. The Mist of Tirna Scithe thing is really random and stupid, in my opinion. And the Alliance version of Siege of Boralus is, again, 90 seconds longer artificially because of one specific roleplay that goes on way too long. So if they cut that, then that change is mostly fine. But if they don't, then you just made players wait around for nothing, and that doesn't feel good. So call me skeptical of these changes so far. Like, good starts, but that's all these are. These are just starting points. They need to do a lot more with these 4 dungeons, in my opinion. So I'm very curious as to what they're going to do, and how kind of brutal the dungeons are. Now, I haven't seen any of the Mythic Plus testing or anything like that. Obviously not in beta. But just reading these for what they are and kind of taking them at what the words on the paper say, I think this is a okay start, but I am not feeling confident that they are going to be able to recognize why we had to use this tech the way that we did. And the Mystic thing is just like, it just feels arbitrarily silly. Like, the odds that you have a Tauren High Mountain Tauren, a Night Elf, a Druid, and an Herbalist, or an Herbalist and a Key, like, generally speaking, there's probably a decent chance. But the times that you don't, you're just missing out on a ton of damage and a ton of quality of life that's overtly punishing for arbitrary and pointless reasons. Like, just make them usable by anybody. Like, it's that simple. Just make them usable by anybody. So that's this video, guys. Short and sweet. I didn't try to take too long with it, but we'll continue to monitor what's going on with Mythic Plus. I've been on the record saying that I think this season is going to be really poorly received. We'll see if I'm correct in that regard so far. Nothing has changed my mind into thinking that I'm going to be wrong. So we'll see. We'll keep up with any sort of new beta news that comes through. So until the next video, hope you stay safe. Hope you're enjoying yourself. If you're having fun, you keep on gaming. We'll see you next time.